evening and welcome, everyone. My name is Alyssa McCusker. I'm the senior curator here at the Utah Museum of Fine Arts. Before we begin this evening, it is important for me to acknowledge that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah and the Utah Museum of Fine Arts recognize and respect the enduring relationship that exists between many indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationship between tribes, states, and the federal government, and we affirm the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. I would also like to take a moment and tell you about an important Salt Lake County program, the Zoo Arts and Parks Program, which we all affectionately know as ZAP. ZAP has been around for 27 years. It funds 232 arts and culture organizations every year, including the Utah Museum of Fine Arts. It provides 4 million free admissions annually. It maintains 70 parks and hundreds of miles of trails. It funds 22 amazing recreation centers all across the county. It supports 26,000 volunteers and 8,000 jobs. ZAP funding is critical to the success of the UMFA. It supports the work we do throughout Salt Lake County and helps to underwrite the numerous free programs offered to residents, families, and students, including this evening's event. ZAP funding makes all the museum's beautiful and thoughtful work possible, including exhibitions, public programming, learning and engagement offerings, and collections care for future generations. Thank you for supporting ZAP and helping to ensure the success of the UMFA. So my colleagues and I are thrilled to host tonight's event related to the stunning exhibition currently on view until December 29th. Bluegrass, Green Skies, American Impressionism and Realism from the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. Bluegrass, Green Skies was organized by the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. Generous support for this project was provided by Art Bridges Foundation. The presenting sponsor is ESRR Impact Endowment. The installation sponsor is Tony F. Bloomberg, and the programming sponsor is Art Bridges Foundation. Please join me in thanking these sponsors. And now I am so pleased and honored to introduce you all to our esteemed guest and speaker this evening, Shannon Vittoria. Dr. Vittoria is Associate Curator of American Art at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art and the curator of the exhibition Bluegrass, Green Skies. Dr. Vittoria's research and writing address a range of fascinating and important topics that advance our critical understanding of the history of American art. She has examined such themes as transnational landscapes and environmental studies, intercultural encounters between European American artists and indigenous communities, paths to artistic professions for women, and the history of California art. Prior to joining the LA County Museum of Art, Dr. Vittoria was Assistant Curator of American Painting and Drawing in the American Wing at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. There she curated the 2021 exhibition Jules Tavernier and the Elem Pomo, which explored the intercultural exchange between the French-American artist Jules Tavernier and the indigenous Pomo community of Elem at Clear Lake in Northern California. Dr. Vittoria also curated the 2019 Metropolitan exhibition, Artistic Encounters with Indigenous America. The Economist called this exhibition timely, thought-provoking, and an arresting examination of non-Native depictions of Native cultures. Dr. Vittoria holds a doctorate from the City University of New York's Graduate Center. Her dissertation, Nature and Nostalgia in the Art of Mary Nimmo Moran, is now the subject of a book manuscript, so look for that. Her wealth of curatorial experience includes fellowships and research positions at such venerable institutions as the New York Historical Society, the Frick Collection, and the Morgan Library and Museum. This evening, we are all so fortunate to hear from Dr. Vittoria about some of the artists in the exhibition Bluegrass, Green Skies, focusing especially on California artists, and particularly California Impressionism, an important branch of American Impressionism. After her presentation, we will have a little time for questions. Following that, I invite you all to join us in the Great Hall for a light reception where we can continue the conversation and connect with each other. From there, I hope you will take the opportunity to enjoy the stunning paintings in the exhibition Bluegrass, Green Skies, as well as our concurrent exhibition of photography, Photo Secession, Painterly Masterworks of Turn-of-the-Century Photography. Please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Shannon Vittoria.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. Let me just make sure. Yep, there we go. Thank you so much, Alyssa, for that very kind introduction. Thank you all for being here this evening, and especially to all of the staff here at the UMFA for the very kind invitation to visit and speak about this really wonderful exhibition. I started at LACMA actually only about 6 months ago, and I think it was day 2. The head of the American Art Department came to me with this project, and so it's just really wonderful to see it come to fruition and for it to have brought me here with all of you today. Now, as you may know, and it was sort of mentioned a little bit in the introduction, LACMA is part of the Art Bridges cohort program, and for those that are sort of unfamiliar with Art Bridges, it's a wonderful foundation that's based in Bentonville, Arkansas. And their mission is really to sort of expand access nationally to American art. And LACMA is a major partner with them as part of their cohort program. And we're really actively engaged in organizing special exhibitions from our American permanent collection that travel not only regionally within Southern California, but now with this inaugural show, traveling nationally as well. So we're thrilled to have this show here in Utah. It'll also travel on to the New Britain Museum in Connecticut. It's going to the Denver Botanical Garden, and then it'll be back at both the Riverside Museum and the Lancaster Museum of Art and History in Southern California. So it'll have a really wonderful, long lifespan, and we're just really excited to share this part of the collection with audiences across the country and then in our own backyard. But the timing of the show here in Utah is especially fortuitous in that it aligns with the 150th anniversary of the first Impressionist exhibition, which was held in Paris in 1874. And given the movement's widespread popularity and global influence, there are several major exhibitions and programs that have been organized to kind of celebrate this anniversary, perhaps the most noteworthy of which is this exhibition organized by the Musée d'Orsay and the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. It's Paris 1874, The Impressionist Moment. And I haven't yet had the pleasure to see this show, but I will be in D.C. next week, and I'm very excited to see it. I think it's quite a momentous moment and an anniversary for a movement that is often credited as being the kind of beginning of modern painting. Now, the painting that graces the cover of this exhibition's catalog, which you see here at the right, is Claude Monet's Impression Sunrise, painted in 1872. It's the painting that essentially gave this movement its name. Depicting a quiet morning at the French port of Le Havre, the painting's material, technique, and modern subject matter, executed very quickly in these pure strokes of vibrant color, shocked critics when it was first exhibited in 1874. Journalist Louis Leroy published a scathing review titled The Exhibition of the Impressionists, in which he imagined skeptical viewers scratching their heads at the works that were then on view. In a fictional account, Leroy writes that one visitor commented about Monet's painting, quote, "I was just telling myself that since I was impressed, There must be some kind of impression here. And what freedom, what ease of workmanship, wallpaper in an embryonic state is more finished than that seascape. Although Leroy used the term impressionist and impressionism disparagingly, it soon became a rallying cry for the artists associated with the movement, including some of our most beloved household names now, Monet, of course, Edgar Degas, Camille Pissarro, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, Alfred Sisley, and Berthe Morisot, among many others. Although they often worked independently, rather than as a kind of unified movement or school, their works share common aesthetics: loose brushwork, a vibrant color palette, attention to capturing the ephemeral effects of light and atmosphere, and together rejecting established academic traditions in order to develop a new and innovative approach to depicting modern life in the urban metropolis. Between 1874 and 1886, the Impressionists, as they came to be known, organized 8 additional exhibitions in Paris. The movement's influence was felt globally, but perhaps nowhere as profoundly or as long-lasting as in the United States. There was, however, only one American artist, none other than Mary Cassatt, who exhibited with the French Impressionists during their 8 exhibitions in Paris. Cassatt, however, was born in Pennsylvania to an upper-middle-class family, and she began studying art at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts in Philadelphia when she was just 15 years old. She spent time in the 1860s traveling and studying throughout Europe and primarily in France, and then eventually decided to settle in Paris in 1874. Her innovative technique soon attracted the attention of contemporary artist Edgar Degas, who in 1877 invited her to exhibit with the Impressionists. She subsequently showed in 4 of their 8 exhibitions and played a critical role in popularizing the movement with artists and collectors on both sides of the Atlantic. Best known for her figural compositions, she established an international reputation for her images of modern women and children. The painting that you see here on the left is Cassatt's Mother About to Wash Her Sleepy Child of 1880. And this work is considered to be among the earliest, if not the first, treatment of the subject for which she would become most famous. This work, I should say, is also in our collection at LACMA, although unfortunately not in this show because it is out on the road in another Mary Cassatt exhibition that just closed at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, but will soon be traveling and opening at the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco. It's a really extraordinary exhibition and a new take on Cassatt, one that looks at her technical prowess as an artist, both as a painter and a printmaker, and one that I would highly recommend. Although not to worry, 2026 is the 100th anniversary of Cassatt's birth, and there are many, many more exhibitions in the works, both in the United States and in Europe. So for all the Cassatt devotees, there are many opportunities to see her work in the coming years. The painting on the right, however, which is in the present exhibition, and the one that sort of welcomes you when you first enter the exhibition, we see that Cassatt continued to engage with this subject for decades, essentially. She depicted the modern Madonna often using members of her family and some of her own domestic workers, including Mathilde Vallée, who was the artist's housekeeper and companion, as the subjects of her painting. And Vallée is believed to be the woman who's depicted in the painting on the right. While the figures' faces are more fully realized, much of the canvas was intentionally left kind of sketchy, almost unfinished in its appearance, although it's important to note that the work is in fact signed at the lower left. Its incompleteness, so to speak, reveals important elements of Cassatt's technique. She began by outlining her figures in cobalt blue before building up their forms with rapidly applied brushstrokes. And the quickness of the execution kind of reinforces the very fleeting nature of this intimate moment between what we believe to be mother and child, although as research has since shown, was in fact just a model Cassatt was using, not a mother herself. Although Cassatt embraced Impressionism's avant-garde aesthetics early on, many American painters and expatriates were, at least initially, less convinced of the movement's staying power. Childe Hassam, for example, an artist who we now closely associate with Impressionism in the United States, claimed to be uninterested and unaffected by the movement during the 3 years that he lived in Paris's Montmartre between 1886 and 1889. When one French critic compared his work to Renoir, Hassam stated, quote, "I do not know anything about Renoir or care anything about Renoir." And he later concluded that his, quote, Paris instruction was superfluous. Of course, Hassam's work tells a very different story, and we can illustrate it quite simply by just the two paintings that you see here. His cropped compositions, vivid color palette, and rapid, sketchy brushwork reveal the artist's deep familiarity with the aesthetics of Impressionism. And he would continue to develop his own personal adaptation of this style as he traveled throughout Europe, while he lived in New York and Boston, and later, as we'll see, when he visited California. In addition to these stylistic influences, Hassam, like many of his French contemporaries, focused his brush on capturing life in the rapidly changing modern world, which was then defined by urban development and global exchange. Although he settled in New York City, Hassam always maintained close ties to his hometown of Boston, often painting vibrant street scenes of the Back Bay, two examples of which you see here, the one on the right being in LACMA's collection in our show, and the one on the left being from the MFA Boston. A feat of modern engineering and urban planning, the Back Bay was developed as a landfill project to construct a new residential neighborhood for Boston's wealthy elite. Looking east toward Beacon Hill with the Charles River at left, Hassam captures a city amidst transition, juxtaposing modern buildings in the foreground with the 18th century gold dome of the Massachusetts State House in the distance. The artist thus skillfully employed Impressionism's innovative style to capture life in a modern metropolis. Now, Cassatt and Hassam were among the hundreds, if not thousands, of American artists who flocked to Paris in the decades after the Civil War. The capital of the 19th century art world, Paris's museums, academies, and exhibition venues offered unparalleled opportunities for aspiring young artists to study and experiment. Soon, a sojourn to Europe was seen as an essential part of any artist's education and training. And while many lived and worked in Paris, by the mid to late 1880s, a group of American artists began to gather in Giverny around the Impressionist master, Claude Monet, who had settled in the northern French village in 1883. And here we see this extraordinary portrait by John Singer Sargent of Monet, painting en plein air, or out of doors, which was the practice that he is perhaps most closely associated with. Sargent visited Monet and Giverny on multiple occasions, and although he often presented his sketches that he made of his friends and fellow artists to them as gifts, this work remained with Sargent in his studio until his death, along with several pictures that he actually purchased directly from Monet, an artist who clearly had a very deep impact upon Sargent in many, many ways. Many other American artists also made the pilgrimage to Giverny in search of Monet's advice, as well as the haystacks he immortalized. Although very few actually got to know and study with the artist, the Boston-based painter Lila Cabot Perry, like Sargent, was an exception. In 1889, at the age of 41, she saw her first Impressionist painting in Paris, a Monet landscape, of course, and spent the next 9 summers in Giverny, where she painted the surrounding countryside and sought the artist's counsel. Although he never took pupils, he did advise Perry on her technique, as she later recalled in a memoir, and she's quoting from Monet here, quote, "When you go out to paint, try to forget what objects you have before you, a tree, a house, a field. Merely think, here is a little square of blue, here an oblong of pink, here a streak of yellow, and paint it just as it looks to you, the exact color and shape, until it gives your own naive impression of the scene before you," end quote. After returning to the United States, Perry played a key role in promoting Impressionist painting. She, like Sargent, purchased works from Monet, bringing them back to the United States for exhibition, a critical means by which most of the American public was first exposed to Impressionism. In 1883, the Paris-based dealer, Paul Durand-Ruel, brought the first Impressionist pictures to the United States. He came with Monet, Manet, Renoir, and Pissarro, among several others, which together made their debut in Boston at a trade fair staged by the Foreign Exhibition Association. Few paid any attention to this show, and those that did tended to dismiss them, as one critic wrote, quote, as the work of myopic amateurs, having no value of any sort. And the criticism from this time period is just extraordinary. It's so much fun to, to read and recite. Despite this, however, Durand-Ruel, the dealer, remained undeterred. 3 years later, and despite Monet's own objections to having his canvases shown in, quote, the land of the Yankees, the dealer nevertheless staged the first large-scale exhibition of Impressionist painting at the American Art Association in New York City. The show featured 289 works, including 40 paintings by Monet, who was promoted in the accompanying catalog as, quote, the head of the school, a landscapist of the first rank. US critics remained skeptical. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle, for example, decried the vermilion grass and blue people, writing that, quote, the massive contributions look amazingly as if painted in a lunatic asylum, singling out Monet as, quote, the very worst thing that anybody has thought it worthwhile to bring across the water. Others, however, were a little bit more sympathetic. The New York Tribune reported that although Impressionist pictures were often criticized for their, quote, blue grass, violently green skies, and water with the coloring of a rainbow, Americans would nevertheless benefit from studying the vitality and beauty of these works. Another reviewer, writing for the Studio magazine, went as far as to thank Durand-Ruel, quote, if he had done nothing more than bring us pictures of the artist, Claude Monet, he would have rendered us a great service. We thank him heartily for this gift. Although many American artists, critics, and collectors were slow to embrace Impressionism, by the late 1880s and early 1890s, when the movement had really lost most of its radical edge in France, it began to flourish in the United States, inspiring artists across the nation for decades to come. Many Americans who studied abroad in both Paris and in Giverny, including Theodore Robinson and John Henry Twachtman, would return to the United States in the late 1880s and early 90s to establish art colonies and organizations for the exhibition and promotion of an American Impressionism. Retreating to country villages and seaside towns in the summer months, including Old Lyme and Cassatt in Connecticut, New Hope in Pennsylvania, and Southampton in New York, these artists painted sentimental views of the American landscape, which by the turn of the 20th century appealed to collectors as nostalgic antidotes to the urban experience. Robinson and Twachtman were among the artists who established the thriving Impressionist art colony in Cassatt, heeding critical advice to paint distinctly American subjects. Twachtman often focused on New England's ports and harbors, spending the last 3 summers of his life in Gloucester, Massachusetts. In the unfinished work that you see here on the right, he rendered Gloucester's wharf from above, looking down onto the deck of a large fishing vessel. His vigorous brushwork reveals his spontaneous approach to painting and captures, as the artist wrote, his joy in the first attack. In addition to painting landscapes and cityscapes, many American Impressionists turned their attention to depicting well-appointed domestic interiors, spaces traditionally associated with femininity. As we saw at the outset of the talk, this subject was one first explored in depth by Mary Cassatt, who, as a woman artist, was in many respects sort of confined to painting domestic life, the women and children of her own inner circle, by both gender and social norms. It was not, however, a subject that was exclusive to women artists of the era. By 1900, a group known as the Boston School had popularized paintings of domestic interiors, merging Impressionist brushwork with their academic figure training. Providing a glimpse into the world of upper middle-class white privilege, these pictures typically feature women engaged in genteel leisure activities such as reading, writing, sewing, or drinking tea in opulent interiors adorned with art, antiques, and popular consumer goods, indicators of their wealth and status within society. While artists such as Childe Hassam experimented with interior scenes, beginning around 1910, he painted a series of what he called his window pictures, featuring women in sunlit apartments, one example of which is in the current show. Other artists came to really specialize in this genre. Frederick Carl Frieseke and John Hubbard Rich, for example, focused on figural compositions, emphasizing the decorative qualities of furnishings and fabrics rendered in brilliant color. Lavish and at times sensual, these works were painted amid growing anxieties over the future roles and responsibilities of women in American society. Advances in education and women's rights led many to seek personal and professional opportunities outside of the home. Even as the new woman emerged as an emblem of feminist independence, Impressionist interiors very much existed apart from these forces for change. Nevertheless, these intimate boudoir pictures were increasingly popular with American collectors. Frieseke's painting, for example, was exhibited at San Francisco's Panama Pacific International Exhibition in 1915, where it won the grand prize. Now, as Impressionism attained widespread appeal and admiration in the United States, a younger generation of American artists began to challenge the style's predominance. Although they shared Impressionism's fascination with modern life, the new movement rejected its interest in leisure, focusing instead on the darker, seamier side of urbanization. Loosely centered around the artist Robert Henry, who taught in Philadelphia prior to relocating to New York City in 1900, these artists came to be known as the realists, or urban realists, later dubbed the Ashcan School. Inspired by the more somber works of Edouard Manet and Edgar Degas, the American realists typically favored a muted color palette and coarsely applied paint over the bright colors and feathery brushwork of Impressionists such as Claude Monet. Amid widespread societal transformation at the turn of the 20th century, the realists, including George Bellows and John Sloan, used their art to capture the impact of urban development and industrialization, notably on the lives of the working classes. And although they were often sympathetic to their plight, it's worth noting that most of these artists lived comfortable middle or upper middle class lives, and their works rarely ventured into the realm of social reform or criticism, instead emphasizing the kind of ruggedness of modern American life. And although these American realists often aimed to distinguish themselves from their Impressionist contemporaries, many had initially experimented with the style, and its influence in both subject matter and technique was certainly long-lasting. Like their Impressionist contemporaries, these artists continued to paint the American scene, focusing on life in the city, the country, and the home. And although they're often best known for their scenes of gritty urban life and entertainment, both Bellows and Sloan spent summers in New England, painting landscapes and scenes of seaside leisure. Bellows, for instance, painted several seascapes, notably in Maine, where he summered between 1911 and 1916. The Coming Storm, which is featured in this exhibition, was likely executed in June of 1916, when he visited the remote town of Camden, Maine, with fellow artist Leon Kroll. Daily coastal storms inspired this energetically painted view of thunderclouds rolling in off Penobscot Bay. His vigorous brushwork conveys the immediacy of the impending storm, and the artist recorded his color scheme for the painting, which was carefully selected to enhance the work's overall mood. This exhibition also features works by artists such as Ernest Lawson, whose career sort of teetered between Impressionism and Realism, not sort of neatly fitting into these categories, I think oftentimes much to the dismay of art historians. As a student at New York's Art Students League, Lawson was introduced to Impressionism through his teachers John Henry Twachtman, whose work we saw earlier, and Julian Eldon Weir. After a period of study in Paris and several summers at the Cobb Art Colony in Connecticut, Lawson settled in Washington Heights, which was then a semi-urban district located on the upper rim of Manhattan. Painting scenes along the Harlem and Hudson rivers, Lawson chronicled the city's developing neighborhoods, often including bridges and mills as emblems of industrial change. Featuring his characteristic jewel tone palette, river landscape is painted with a thick, heavy impasto, which the artist often applied using a palette knife or even his thumb. And I must say that this is a work much better enjoyed in person, so I encourage you to see it in the galleries. The kind of vibrancy of his brushwork just really kind of leaps off the canvas. And although Impressionism and Realism were often presented as two distinct opposing movements, we see in this exhibition the ways in which artists often move fluidly between these two styles. John Grabick, for example, began his career painting light-filled, impressionist-inspired scenes, such as sunlit houses, which we see here on the left, before turning his attention to urban subject matter in the 1920s. Fascinated by the clotheslines strung between the tenements of New York's Lower East Side, he executed a series of paintings exploring the theme of wash day. However, the artist's elevated perspective and bright color palette, including the stark white laundry, belie some of the harsh realities of tenement life in New York City. Like many of his contemporaries, however, he was less concerned with the sort of social commentary than he was with capturing a sense of the city's vibrancy and life. Although both American Impressionism and Realism are most closely associated with urban centers and coastal towns of the Northeast, the movement, as I mentioned, swept the nation, developing regional followings in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Texas, and of course, in California, where Impressionism, I would argue, found some of its greatest practitioners amongst artists who were working in colonies across the state, from Los Angeles and Laguna Beach in the south to Carmel, Monterey, and San Francisco in the north. The state's diverse topography had long inspired landscape painters. However, its warm climate and sunny skies were especially conducive to working on plein air, or out of doors, one of the characteristic techniques of Impressionist landscape painting. Several artists associated with California Impressionism, including Evelyn McCormick, whose work you see here, as well as Theodore Warris and Guy Rose, who we'll see in just a minute, were born in California and received their earliest artistic training in San Francisco. Although they subsequently spent time in Europe, including in Giverny, they ultimately returned to California, applying the lessons learned abroad to capturing the unique topography of the Golden State. In fact, McCormick was among the first generation of American artists working in Giverny. She spent the summers of 1890 and 91 painting in the Impressionist art colony before returning to Northern California, where she depicted the lush landscapes of the Carmel Valley and Monterey Peninsula. The artist first experimented with painting colorful pumpkins in a verdant landscape while in Giverny, exhibiting the work that you see here on the left at the 1891 Salon. When returning to the subject several years later, she pushed her impressionistic paint handling even further, dissolving Carmel's landscape into a dizzying patchwork of brightly colored brushstrokes. And as mentioned, Rose and Warris were, like McCormick, California natives who trained in Europe, bringing the lessons of French Impressionism back to the West Coast. Painting sweeping views of Carmel and Monterey, they often depicted California's rugged landscape under a variety of weather conditions and at various times of day. In the work seen here, the empty sand dunes convey a sense of solitude, although their highly saturated color palettes and thick impasto fill the atmosphere with a brilliant, almost glaring sunlight. While many California artists found modest success painting their local landscapes, the region's status as an influential Impressionist outpost gained national attention in 1914, when one of the leading East Coast Impressionists, William Merritt Chase, accepted an offer to teach a summer art class in the colony at Carmel by the Sea. Earlier that year, the New York Times had declared California's coast to be, quote, a great storehouse of material with which the artists of this country are much too little acquainted. Of all the region, Carmel is the center of art, life, and interest. Although this ended up being Chase's last summer art class, he died just 2 years later, it was also his largest, with more than 100 students who enrolled in his summer session in Carmel. And remarkably, it was the same year, 1914, that Childe Hassam visited nearby Point Lobos, where he painted the rugged cliffs and cypress trees of the Pacific coast. Hassam had begun traveling on the West Coast in the early 20th century, although California scenes by the artist are relatively rare, and scholars have located only about 12 examples. This work was the result of a sketching trip that Hassam took with the California landscape painter Frances McComas. McComas's wife later recounted the amusing story of how her husband was incensed by Hassam when he insisted on turning his back upon the view of the coast to paint the scene from memory. Hassam's painting method, working here from memory rather than directly from nature, may account for many of the similarities that we see in this view of Carmel with many of the landscapes he painted in the coast of Maine. Hassam seems to have approached both shores in similar terms. He focused on Carmel's weather-hewn boulders, constructing them with the same forceful short brushstrokes and rich contrasting hues that appear in many of his main pictures. Only the cypress tree, bent from the pounding ocean winds, alludes to a western locale. When a group of Hassam's California landscapes were exhibited in an exhibition in the winter of 1915, critics found them to be, quote, striking, praising the artist for his remarkable effects of filtered sunlight. Now, the presence of artists such as Chase and Hassam drew national attention to California's growing Impressionist art colonies, inspiring a new generation of artists to paint their local landscape. In Southern California, the German-born artist William Wendt built a home studio with his wife, the sculptor Julia Bracken, in Laguna Beach in 1918. His unique and striking style, in which he combines his academic training with the aesthetics of Impressionism, quickly made him a leader of Southern California's emerging school of landscape painters. He was particularly attracted to the appearance of California's foothills in the springtime, when seasonal rains, at least they used to bring, lush green grass to Southern California's landscape. Wendt's bold color palette and flattened rhythmic brushwork contributed to the decorative quality of his work. In fact, the odd proportions and kind of horizontality of the painting, which you see here on the right and which is in the show, may indicate that it was actually intended for a specific location within the home of the patron, Mr. and Mrs. Robert Phillips McReynolds, who commissioned the work directly from the artist. And you can sort of imagine it almost appearing over a mantle or over a doorway in someone's home. Southern California's the unique topography and its verdant flora also inspired the work of another great landscape painter, Granville Redmond, who was based in Los Angeles and developed a reputation for his paintings of golden poppies, California's state flower. In this exceptionally large example, the artist captures a peak springtime bloom, typically in February and March, when vibrant wildflowers carpet Southern California's landscape. This is now one of the more popular Instagram spots. Painting on an especially rough-hewn canvas, and so I really encourage you to look at this one in person because you can sort of really see the canvas coming through with the paint. It added this considerable amount of texture to the scene, and he skillfully contrasted the warm orange hues of the foreground flowers with the cool blues of the distant mountain peaks. This work was acquired directly from the artist by the Hollywood silent film actor Raymond Griffith, who was a close friend. And it is perhaps only fitting that a show from LACMA's collection would end with a Hollywood reference. But I must say that this is perhaps one of my favorite works in the exhibition, maybe even one of my favorite works in LACMA's collection. But more importantly, I think for our purposes today, it really encapsulates the themes of this show and really American Impressionism more broadly. And so I'd like to end this evening's talk with a quote that I actually started the exhibition with, from the critic Charles Brinton, who wrote in 1916, quote, it must not be assumed that American Impressionism and French Impressionism are identical. The American painter accepted the spirit, not the letter, of the new doctrine. And I think we can see quite vividly here that from the poppy fields of Giverny to the foothills of Southern California, that Impressionism's bluegrass and green skies evolved into a distinctly American art form. Thank you. And I'd be more than happy to take any questions. Yes, I think we have some microphones circulating too, or I can, if you want to project, I can repeat the question.
Thank you. I have actually two questions. The
Sure.
first one is, you've emphasized landscape art for the Impressionists, but also I always think of Impressionism as having a lot of sensuality and sexuality.
Mm-hmm.
Did that come across to the States also?
Yes and no, not nearly as much as you see in the work of the French Impressionists, if you're thinking of Renoir, Degas. But you do see it if we go back, especially in the work of Frieseke, an artist who painted these sort of intimate, as they call them, boudoir scenes. You can see in the work, maybe less so in the image here and more in the work itself in the gallery, that she isn't, her sort of kimono is sort of slipping off of her and her breasts are exposed. So maybe not the kind of nudity that you might get in a French Impressionist painting, but certainly alluded to here, but not nearly, it's an excellent point, not nearly as much as you see, I think, in a lot of the French works.
And then my second question was, you talked about the growth out of this movement of American realism.
Yeah.
And you said that it, for the most part, avoided making social commentary.
Yeah.
And at the same time, photography, at exactly that same time,
Yes.
was really focused on making social commentary. Was there a tension between this or a cross-conflict between those two fields? Because they were contemporaneous.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's go, we can look at this. This is this extraordinary work, George Bellows' Cliff Dwellers. I would say that in the painting, social commentary was the exception rather than the rule. And if you're thinking of the work of Jacob Riis and Louis Hine, where they had a much more socially driven mission, the painters, for the most part, did not necessarily share that. The one caveat perhaps being that Bellows actually, this painting, Cliff Dwellers, he did as a lithograph for the cover of the magazine The Masses. And the title that accompanied it when it was reproduced for the magazine was, "Why Don't They Go to the Country for Vacation?" So the artist was, they were sort of aware of it, but it wasn't, I would say, perhaps necessarily the driving force of a lot of the art they were producing. But there were exceptions. There was one sculptor in particular, an artist who I've actually become very, very interested in, Absentia Eberle, who, she was from Iowa. She spent some time in Italy. She comes back to New York, and she actually decided that she was going to live. She worked as a settlement worker, and she lived in the tenements and sculpted a lot of her neighbors. And her work and she very much saw her artistic practice as serving a kind of political, social, consciousness-raising purpose. But again, more so perhaps the exception than the rule with a lot of the artists we now refer to as the ashcan. Thank you for those. That's great. Thanks. Yes.
So you walk in the door of your new job, and you're presented with this project, and that was 6 months ago.
Yeah.
And I don't think this exhibit is at its first stop. Perhaps it was probably shown at your museum first.
No, this is actually its first stop.
Oh.
But I should say, thank you very much for that. I should.
But take us through the 6 months.
Yeah. No. Okay. Much credit goes to my my colleague and the head of the American Art Department, Leah Lembeck, who actually sort of conceptualized this show a few years ago, I believe during the pandemic. and sort of compiled some of the initial ideas for the checklist and the themes. She secured the venues, a lot of the heavy lifting that went into me stepping in 6 months ago and receiving this beautiful project and having the opportunity to focus on the research and the writing and the kind of deep dive that we always just dream to have the time to do. When you start a new job, turns out you actually sometimes have the time to do it. So it was much longer in the making than just the last 6 months. But for me as a newcomer to the institution, it was really a fantastic way for me to get to know the collection, to really dive in depth into some of these works, especially given the amazing strength that LACMA has of California Impressionism. It was a real deep dive and a wonderful opportunity to kind of immerse myself in this history. Well, we can certainly continue the conversation over drinks and food, or if there are any last questions. Okay, well, thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it.